The lecture hall of the Galactic Academy was shaped like a great silver shell, layered in light and sound. Voices of 100 species murmured softly, like rain across glass. The air smelled faintly of ozone and distant storms, carried through the vents from the open atmosphere of Tirask IX, a planet that never stopped humming. At the center of the vast room, a crystalline figure shimmered beneath the pale glow of the ceiling. Professor Carthven of the Thrill species was ancient even by galactic standards. His body was a sculpture of translucent quartz, his voice like the ringing of glass bells. His lectures were known for one thing, breaking illusions, and today he had chosen the humans. He lifted a gleaming hand, light refracting through his many facets. "Today," he said, his tone calm, "we discuss the most primitive act in sentient history, killing." The word itself made the air heavier. Across the hall, students from 50 worlds stiffened. Scaled, furred, feathered, or metallic, they all turned their gazes toward the human section. 30 humans sat together near the back, wearing the gray cadet uniforms of the Galactic Corps. Most of them had fought before joining the academy. Some bore faint scars across their necks or knuckles. One even had a burn that no amount of biogel could erase. They sat quietly, but every one of them felt the weight of that word. The professor tilted his head. "I ask you all across the stars in the name of understanding, who here has taken a life?" Silence followed. It stretched long and deep. Then slowly, hands began to rise. Not alien hands, not claws nor talons nor tendrils. Human hands. Every human in the hall, save one, lifted their hand without hesitation. The rustle of movement was soft, but it felt deafening. The alien students whispered among themselves, their voices sharp and clicking in disbelief. Every human, except for one. Lee Vance sat at the end of the row, her hands folded on her lap. Her fingers twitched, but she didn't move. She was young, 23, with sharp eyes and a medic's calm. Her hair was cropped short to fit under a field helmet. Her uniform bore the silver insignia of the Medical Corps, the only branch forbidden from taking life unless in direct defense. Carthven's glowing eyes shifted toward her. "You human medic," he said softly, "you did not raise your hand." Lee's heart thudded against her ribs. Every alien in the hall was staring now. She felt small beneath their gazes, so many colors, so many eyes that did not blink. She straightened her back and spoke, her voice steady but low. "No, Professor, I haven't killed anyone." "Why?" he asked. "You are human, are you not? Your kind has made war since the first spark of civilization. You burn worlds for victory, you fight even your own, yet you have not killed." Lee swallowed. "I'm a medic, I patch people up, I don't take lives, I save them." Carthven's crystal body hummed faintly. The sound was like grinding ice. "And you believe that makes you better than the others?" The question wasn't cruel. It was curious but sharp enough to cut. Lee shook her head. "No, sir, it doesn't make me better. It just means I do a different kind of fighting." A ripple of quiet laughter came from the alien students, like the flutter of dry leaves. One, a tall insectoid from the Curon system, clicked its mandibles mockingly. "Humans fight everything," it said in its sibilant tone. "Even themselves. Perhaps she just hasn't had the chance yet." Lee ignored it, but her stomach tightened. At the front of the room, one of her classmates, Sergeant Juno Park, raised his hand higher. His voice was gravel rough. "Don't take it wrong, Professor. We didn't all kill because we wanted to. Some of us just didn't have a choice." Carthven regarded him for a long moment. "And yet you did it." Juno met his gaze evenly. "Yeah, and we'll live with it every day." Something shifted in the hall. The tension between the alien cadets and the humans was old and heavy. The Galactic Academy liked to speak of peace, of reason, of logic, but humans were still new to this grand alliance of species. They were seen as dangerous, unpredictable, emotional. The species that still cried when they killed and still fought when they were broken. Carthven's voice softened. "You all raise your hands so easily. Tell me, does it not haunt you?" Juno looked at Lee, then back at the professor. "Of course it does. That's what makes us different." The alien professor tilted his crystalline head, light shifting across his facets. "Different how?" Juno's mouth curved into a grim smile. "Because we remember every face." The hall fell silent again. For a long time, no one spoke. The only sound was the soft hum of the walls and the faint whir of oxygen recyclers. Lee sat very still. She could feel her pulse racing in her neck. She had seen death more than she cared to count. She had pulled men and women out of burning ships, held hands slick with blood, watched pupils fade. But she had never been the one to pull the trigger. And part of her wondered if that really made her any different at all. Professor Carthvin's eyes dimmed slightly. He turned away from the humans, addressing the class once more. Curious, among hundreds of species, it is only humanity that answers so, completely, so willingly. You do not fear the truth of death, you own it. He paused, letting the words echo. Perhaps that is why your kind survives what others cannot. No one knew what he meant then. But in the weeks that followed, when the skis over Tirask IX turned to fire, and death came not as theory but as storm, every one of them would remember that question. Who has killed? And the medic who did not raise her hand would learn what it truly meant to save a life. The first explosion came during morning drills. It wasn't loud at first, just a distant rumble that shook dust from the ceiling of the training hall. The cadets paused mid-movement, confused. Then the ground lurched, lights flickered, and a second blast rolled through the campus like thunder tearing the sky apart. Sirens wailed, the walls flashed red. Lee Vance dropped the training drone she'd been calibrating and ran for the door. Outside, the horizon burned. The sky over Tirask IX, usually pale gold and calm, was now streaked with fire. Ships, black and jagged, fell through the clouds like knives. The Keth, someone whispered, they're here. The Keth were not a new name to the galaxy. Everyone at the Academy knew of them, the pirates turned conquerors, the species that raised worlds and enslaved survivors. But they were supposed to be far from this sector, broken and scattered. That's what everyone believed. They had been wrong. Within minutes, comms filled with shouting. The orbital defense grid was down. The fleet had been ambushed. The Academy, the proud heart of the Galactic Alliance's learning, was suddenly a battlefield. Lee sprinted toward the infirmary, boots echoing in the chaos. Around her, cadets and staff flooded the corridors. Panic spread faster than sound. Alien students screamed orders in a dozen tongues. Drones zipped overhead, scanning for damage. She reached the medical bay, breathless. The doors hissed open to chaos. Injured cadets were already being carried in burns, shrapnel, broken limbs. "Get me field packs," she shouted. "Seal that breach before the atmosphere drops." Her hands moved before her mind could. Spray foam, suture gel, pressure seals, it all became rhythm muscle memory. A human engineer with half his suit melted. A thrill student with glass skin fractures. She worked through it all, face pale but steady. Outside the bay, she could hear the war growing. Explosions closer now. The distant crack of railguns, the deep scream of collapsing towers. Then the comm pinged. It was Juno Park. "Vance, you alive?" "I'm here," she answered, pressing a sealant over a wound. "Medical bay's full." "Get ready to move. They're breaching the South Dome. We're gathering whoever can fight." She froze. "I'm not a soldier anymore." "Doesn't matter, you'll be needed. Bring what you can. We're not evacuating, we're holding the line." The channel cut. Lee looked around the bay. The other medics, only 2 left, were already working on a triage queue. Outside the windows, the burning sky glowed red and orange, reflecting in her eyes. She knew what she had to do. She grabbed a medpack, slung it across her shoulder, and ran. The South Dome had once been a garden, now it was hell. Smoke choked the air. Alien plants burned, filling the space with sweet, sickly fumes. The glass above was shattered. Through it, Lee could see the Keth dropships, black metal beasts descending on thrusters of fire. Dozens of cadets crouched behind broken barricades. Some were crying. Some were loading weapons with shaking hands. Juno Park stood at the front, his uniform scorched, rifle in hand. When he saw Lee, he gave a grim smile. "You came. You called." He nodded toward the barricade. "We've got maybe 50 left here. The Keth have hundreds. The professor's trying to get civilians to the deep shelters, but they won't make it if this dome falls." Lee swallowed. "You think we can hold them?" He shrugged. "Doesn't matter if we can, we have to." She looked around. Humans and aliens huddled together, species that days ago couldn't agree on lunch now standing shoulder to shoulder. Some wore armor, some didn't. Most were terrified. Lee dropped beside a wounded cadet and started working, hands moving fast. "What happened to the orbital fleet?" she asked. "Gone," Juno said quietly. Hit before they knew what was happening, no reinforcements coming. She sealed another wound, stood, and looked toward the shattered horizon. Keth's ship streaked downward like falling stars. "Then it's just us," she murmured. "Just us," he agreed. The first wave hit like a storm. The Keth were huge, scaled, armored, their voices like grinding metal. They came in packs, roaring through the broken glass, plasma rifles blazing. Lee stayed low, dragging the injured back as the humans opened fire. The sound was deafening. Laser bursts lit the air like lightning. Metal screamed. Flesh burned. Juno's squad fought like demons. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and still they pushed forward. A Curon cadet leaped onto a barricade, firing twin pistols until a blast took him down. Juno caught his weapon midair and kept firing. Lee couldn't stop to think. She worked on instinct, patching, sealing, injecting pain blockers, dragging bodies out of the open. Her heart hammered so hard it hurt. "Medic," someone shouted. She ran toward the voice and skidded to her knees beside a human soldier clutching his stomach. She pressed her hands to the wound, but the blood was too much. "It's okay," she whispered. "I've got you." The soldier's eyes were wild. He grabbed her wrist. "They're monsters," he gasped. "Don't let them win." Then he went still. Lee stared at his face for a heartbeat too long. Around her, explosions rattled the air. A shadow loomed, one of the Keth, its armor black and scarred, towering over her. It raised its weapon. Before it could fire, a plasma bolt tore through its chest. The alien fell, smoking. Juno appeared, panting. "You good?" Lee nodded shakily. "Thanks." He gave her a grim grin. "Welcome to the war, Doc." Hours passed. The fighting didn't stop. The dome was rubble, but they held the ground. By the time the sun set, the survivors were few, the wounded many. The air smelled of blood and ozone. As night fell over Tirask IX, Lee looked up at the stars burning through the smoke. For the first time, she saw them not as distant lights, but as silent witnesses. The Galactic Academy was gone. The war had come to their doorstep. And somewhere deep inside her, Lee Vance, the medic who had never raised her hand, felt something new take root. Not hatred, not rage. Resolve. Smoke hung over the ruins of the South Dome like a black veil. The fires still burned, their glow reflected in shattered glass and pools of alien blood. The air was hot, heavy, full of metal and dust. For a brief, fragile moment, there was silence. Then through the broken corridors of the academy came the sound of human voices, rough, tired, but steady. Orders shouted, boots scraping, weapons being reloaded. The humans were regrouping. Lee Vance stood among them, her uniform streaked with ash and blood. Her hands trembled slightly as she sealed the last wound on a fallen cadet. She had stopped counting how many she'd saved, or how many she hadn't. Juno Park limped over, his rifle slung across his shoulder. He looked worn, but his eyes still burned with that fierce, unbreakable light. "They're pulling back," he said, "probably regrouping for another strike." Lee wiped sweat from her brow. "How many do we have left?" He hesitated. "Maybe 20 that can still fight, another 15 wounded bad." Lee exhaled slowly. "That's not enough." "It's what we've got," Juno said, "and we're not dying easy." Nearby, alien cadets, those who had stayed to fight, watched the humans with mixed expressions. Awe, fear, confusion. The humans were dirty, bloodied, laughing quietly between reloads. They were bruised, broken, and somehow alive. Professor Carthven arrived then, his crystalline form cracked from a near explosion. His voice still carried that calm, bell-like tone, though weaker now. "You humans," he said softly, "you fight even when reason says to flee." Juno looked up at him. "Yeah," he said simply, "that's kind of our thing." Carthven studied him, fascinated. "Your tactics are illogical. You attack when outnumbered, you charge instead of retreating, you sacrifice yourselves to protect strangers. Why?" Juno's expression hardened. "Because if we don't stand, no one else will." There was no pride in his voice, only truth. The next hours passed in fragments. The academy became a fortress. Humans welded doors shut, turned classroom tables into barricades, and wired corridors with makeshift traps. The aliens followed their lead, though most didn't understand why these fragile mammals still believed they could hold out. One insectoid cadet, Kiri of the Curon, clattered up to Lee as she worked on a broken comm relay. "Why do your kind not give up? she asked, her voice full of disbelief. The odds are hopeless. You cannot win. Lee smiled faintly, though her hands were shaking from exhaustion. You ever seen what happens when a human gives up? Kiri tilted her head, confused. Neither have I, Lee said. When the Keth came again, they hit harder. The ground shook with each impact. Their ships strafed the campus, their soldiers flooding the halls, but the humans were ready. They used what the Academy had taught them and what it hadn't. They set ambushes, they fought dirty. A Keth squad stormed a corridor only to trip over a tangle of plasma cables Lee had wired into a door. The explosion vaporized half of them. Another group was trapped in a hall filled with nitrogen fog, where the humans struck from shadows with scavenged blades and repurposed mining tools. To the other species, war was strategy and precision. To humans, war was survival, chaos turned into purpose. And they thrived in it. Juno led the counterattack from the front, roaring orders over the din. His armor was cracked, his face streaked with soot, but his grin never faded. Push him back, take the left flank, don't give him a second to breathe. Lee stayed close behind the line, dragging the wounded out of crossfire, her medpack nearly empty. She didn't stop. She couldn't. Every scream, every plea, she answered. Medic! She sprinted to another fallen cadet, a reptilian alien whose chest was torn open by plasma fire. The wound sizzled. He grabbed her wrist, claws digging into her sleeve. Why do you help me? He gasped. We called your kind monsters. Lee didn't look up as she worked. You're bleeding. Monsters don't care about that. The alien stared at her, eyes wide, then closed them as she pressed the sealant to his chest. By the time the second wave ended, the Academy grounds were a graveyard. Bodies, Keth and cadets alike, littered the shattered tiles. The humans stood among them, blackened and exhausted, but unbroken. Professor Carthven stepped out from cover, his body flickering faintly in the fading light. He had watched it all, every reckless charge, every desperate defense. He had seen humans fight when logic said it was over. He approached Juno, who sat on a broken column cleaning his weapon. You should not be alive, Carthven said quietly. Juno chuckled, voice rough. We get that a lot. You have lost more than half your number. Yeah, Juno stared out at the battlefield, but so have they. Carthven tilted his head, trying to understand. You are a violent species, and yet you fight not for conquest but for each other. Juno looked at him. We don't fight because we like it, Professor. We fight because someone has to. Because if we don't stand between them and the helpless, then we become the monsters they think we are. The professor fell silent. The idea seemed impossible, sacrifice without gain, war without greed. He had lived for centuries and never seen a species that fought like this, not with hatred but with heart. Lee joined them, limping slightly. She sat beside Juno and leaned her head against the cold stone. Her eyes were distant. They'll come again, she whispered. We can't hold forever. Juno smiled faintly. Then we'll hold until forever ends. That night the surviving humans gathered by the shattered courtyard. The alien cadets, those who had stayed, stood around them silent. The stars above were dim through the smoke, but they shone still. Lee looked up at them, her hands still stained red. She thought of home, of oceans and forests, of the people who had sent them here to learn peace. And she understood something then. Peace was not the absence of war. Peace was what you built in spite of it. As the fires flickered low and the wounded slept, Lee whispered to herself. They think we're the violent ones, but we're the ones who can't stop saving each other. No one heard her except the stars. But the stars would remember. The war did not stop when the sun rose. It only changed its color. Morning light bled through the smoke like a pale ghost, touching the ruins of the Academy. The air smelled of metal, fire, and something worse, burnt life. The ground was slick with ash and coolant. The walls that once held laughter and learning were now painted in red and black. Lee Vance stood in the middle of it all. Her uniform was torn, her medpack was almost empty. She had not slept in 2 days and her hands shook whenever she stopped moving. But she did not stop. She could not. Everywhere she looked, someone needed her. A thrilled cadet with half his crystalline chest missing. A human with his leg blown apart. A Curon insectoid lying silent, her shell cracked open like glass. Lee worked through it all, sealing, stitching, injecting, whispering words that no one could hear through the screams. Stay with me. Almost done. You're not dying today. Each word felt smaller than the pain around her, but she said them anyway. Sometimes words were the only things that still worked. Behind her, the distant rumble of battle never stopped. The Keth were everywhere now, streets, domes, even the sky. The Galactic Defense Fleet was gone. The communication towers were gone. The Academy's proud banners lay burned in the dirt. Lee paused to catch her breath. Her gloves were soaked through. She had lost track of time. A sharp voice cut through the chaos. Medic, over here. She ran toward it, slipping over debris. A young human cadet lay pinned under a fallen beam. He was barely conscious, blood soaking through his jacket. Lee dropped beside him, pulling the beam aside with all her strength. It's okay, she said. I've got you. The cadet coughed, his breath wet and shallow. They're coming again. Lee shook her head. Don't talk, you're safe. But she could hear it too, the deep growl of engines, the echo of boots. The Keth were advancing again. Medic, someone else called from the comms. It was Juno Park, his voice rough and strained. They've breached the central dome. Reactor levels are spiking. We're falling back. Lee froze. The reactor. If the Keth reached it, the whole academy would go up in flames. Understood, she said. Her voice was steady, but her stomach turned to ice. She finished sealing the cadet's wound, pressed a stim into his arm, and stood. You'll live, she whispered, even though she wasn't sure. Then she ran. The central dome was chaos. Fires burned everywhere. The floor trembled beneath her boots. Alarms screamed. Broken machines sparked like dying stars. Humans and aliens fought side by side, firing from behind shattered pillars. The Keth poured through the breaches, armored and monstrous, their weapons hissing with blue plasma. Lee ducked behind a console, breath ragged. Her medpack clattered against her hip. She saw Juno across the room, shouting orders, his voice hoarse but strong. He was bleeding from a wound on his shoulder, but he kept firing, kept moving. Lee, he called when he saw her. What are you doing here? Where else would I be? She shouted back. He grinned despite the chaos. That's my medic. The grin faded when a blast struck the wall beside him, throwing him to the floor. Lee screamed his name and sprinted through the crossfire. Bullets and plasma bolts whizzed past her, lighting up the smoke in flashes of blue and red. She dropped beside him, grabbed his arm. His face was pale, his blood dark against the dust. Stay with me, she whispered. Don't, he coughed, choking. Don't stop, the core's about to go, you need to get out. Not without you. He tried to laugh, but it came out as a gasp. Always the stubborn one. A shadow fell across them. A Keth soldier, massive and armored, raised his weapon, blue energy building at its tip. Lee's heart froze. She had no cover, no weapon, only her medkit. And then something broke inside her. She didn't think, she didn't breathe. She just moved. Her hand found Juno's fallen pistol. She turned, aimed, and fired. The shot hit the Keth in the chest. It stumbled. She fired again and again until it fell in a heap of smoke and armor. The sound echoed, ringing in her skull. Lee stood there shaking, the gun still raised. She had never fired one before, never killed, never wanted to. Her hands were numb, her ears full of silence. Juno stared up at her, eyes wide. Vance, he whispered, you did it. She looked down at the body. I didn't want to. I know, he said softly. That's why it matters. Lee helped him to his feet. Together they limped toward the reactor chamber. The massive core pulsed violently, lights flashing red. The Keth had planted charges, but their devices were tangled in the cooling lines. Can you disarm them? She asked. Juno grinned faintly. I can try, but if I mess up. We both go up, she finished. He nodded, yeah. She swallowed hard, then I'll help. For the next few minutes they worked side by side, fingers trembling over wires and heat panels. Sparks flew. Warnings blared. Sweat ran down Lee's face as she focused, every heartbeat louder than the alarms. When the last wire snapped free, the reactor lights shifted from red to yellow. Stable. They had done it. Lee let out a shaking breath. Juno dropped against the wall, exhausted. Outside, the sound of fighting was fading. The Keth were retreating, for now. Lee stared down at her trembling hands. The pistol still hung from her belt, heavy as guilt. She whispered to herself, voice breaking, I killed to save him. Juno looked up at her, eyes tired but kind. Then you saved more than one life today. Lee didn't answer. She just sat there, surrounded by smoke and silence, her hands still shaking. For the first time, she understood what the others had meant when they raised their hands. It wasn't pride, it wasn't shame. It was the weight you carried when you had done what no one else could, and lived to remember it. The night after the reactor battle was quiet, too quiet. Tirask IX was still burning. The horizon glowed with dying embers, painting the sky in dull orange and gray. The wind carried the smell of ash and blood, drifting through the ruins of the Galactic Academy. The once great halls were now only bones of steel and glass. Lee Vance sat outside the shattered infirmary, her hands resting on her knees. Her gloves were gone. She could still feel the ghost of the gun in her fingers. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the Keth soldier falling, its body smoking, its eyes wide and empty. Her first kill. She had done it to protect Juno, to save lives. But the image would not leave her. It burned in her chest like a fever. The other humans were quiet too. No laughter, no jokes now. They sat in small groups, fixing weapons, patching wounds, staring into the fire. They had fought 3 battles in 2 days. Half their number was gone. Juno limped over, his shoulder bandaged. He dropped beside her with a tired groan. "Still breathing?" he asked. "Barely," Lee said. Her voice was flat. He smiled weakly. "Then you're doing better than most." She didn't return the smile. "Juno, I killed someone." He looked at her for a long time. "Yeah, you did." "It doesn't feel right." "It's not supposed to." Lee stared into the fire. "How do you live with it?" Juno took a slow breath. "You don't forget it, you just remember why you did it. If you killed because you had to save someone, then that's different from killing to win. There's a line, Vance, you didn't cross it." Lee's throat tightened. "But I still did it." He nodded. "And you saved me. You saved the reactor, you saved everyone left here, that's what matters." She said nothing for a long time. The fire popped softly between them. In the distance, a ship burned in the sky like a second moon falling. The next morning, the air was alive again, but not with life. The Keth had returned. Lee was awakened by the sirens, the deep mechanical roar echoing through the ruins. The ground shook as dropships thundered down in waves. The Keth wanted the academy destroyed completely. "Positions," Juno shouted over the comms. "All survivors, hold your sectors. We can't let them reach the shelters." The humans scrambled into position. What was left of the alien cadets joined them. Even Professor Carthven, cracked and dimmed, stayed behind to coordinate from the control room. Lee grabbed her rifle this time. It felt wrong, heavy in her hands, but she didn't drop it. The medic had become a fighter. As the first Keth breached the perimeter, the battle began. It was chaos. The Keth came in waves, massive and armored, their weapons glowing with blue plasma. The humans met them head-on, screaming battle cries that echoed through the ruins. Every explosion shook the earth. Lee stayed near the front line, alternating between shooting and treating the wounded. Her movements were sharp, automatic. She didn't think about fear anymore. There wasn't time. A blast hit nearby, throwing her into a wall. Her ears rang. The world spun. When she opened her eyes, everything was dust and smoke. "Vance," Juno's voice crackled through her earpiece. "They're pushing past Sector 3. We can't hold." She struggled to her feet. "How bad?" "Bad. Reactor side's gone. We're falling back to the courtyard." Lee started running, boots pounding against shattered tiles. Around her, humans fired from cover, shouting to one another through the smoke. She passed a fallen cadet, human, barely 18. She hesitated, then forced herself to move on. There was no time to save him. When she reached the courtyard, the scene stopped her heart. The Keth were everywhere. Their ships had landed in the open square, disgorging dozens of troops. Juno and the survivors were pinned behind what was left of the fountain. "Medic," someone shouted. "We're out of ammo." Lee dropped beside Juno, firing into the advancing line. "We can't stay here," she yelled. "Nowhere else to go," he shouted back. "We hold or we die." A plasma bolt struck close, scorching the ground. Lee's pack caught fire. She ripped it off and stomped it out. Her chest burned from the smoke, her eyes stung. Then, above the roar, she heard a sound, a rising whine. Juno looked up. His face went pale. "Orbital strike." Lee followed his gaze. One of the Keth ships hovering overhead was charging its cannon, the kind that could erase a city block. "No," Lee whispered. "Not here, not now." She grabbed her comm. "Professor, they're targeting the courtyard. You need to." "I am aware," Carthvin's calm voice answered, layered with static. "There is one chance." "What are you talking about?" "I can reroute the station's power grid to overload their ship's targeting system, but I must do it manually, from the core." Lee froze. "You won't survive that." "Perhaps not, but I am already cracking, young one. I will do this for your kind for all of ours." The comm cut off. "Professor," Lee shouted, but there was no reply. A moment later, the ground shook violently. The Keth ship in the sky flickered, then exploded in a brilliant flash. The shockwave tore through the courtyard, throwing Lee and Juno to the ground. When the light faded, the sky was quiet. The surviving Keth, stunned and leaderless, began to retreat. The battle was over. Lee staggered to her feet, her ears ringing. Smoke curled from the horizon where the ship had fallen. Around her, the wounded cried out softly. The air was full of dust and silence. Juno leaned on her shoulder, bleeding but smiling weakly. "We're alive." She looked around at what remained of the academy, the ruins, the dead, the fire. "Barely," she whispered. Juno nodded, barely still enough. Lee looked toward the reactor dome, now nothing but rubble and light. She thought of Carthvin, the alien who had once called them savages, now dying to save them. Her voice trembled. "He believed in us." "Yeah," Juno said softly, "and maybe now the galaxy will too." Lee turned her gaze upward. The stars shone faintly through the smoke, cold, distant, watching. She didn't feel like a hero, she just felt tired. But deep down, she knew this wasn't over. The war would go on, the pain would go on. And so would they. Because that was what humans did. They kept going, even when fire and flesh were all that was left. The fires burned for 3 days before the sky cleared. By then, the Galactic Academy was nothing but wreckage, blackened spires and collapsed domes. Smoke still drifted across the plains of Tirask IX, carrying the bitter scent of war. The wind howled through broken corridors where lectures had once echoed. And yet somehow there was still life. Lee Vance stood beside the ruins of the central dome, her medkit hanging empty at her side. She looked over the courtyard where the last battle had taken place. The ground was scorched, littered with shards of alien glass and twisted metal. Every step crunched softly beneath her boots. The war was over. The Keth had retreated, what was left of them. No one had heard from the fleet since the explosion that took out their flagship. The survivors, humans and aliens alike, had gathered near the old fountain, the same one they'd fought to protect. Now it was cracked, filled not with water but with makeshift candles, each one a tiny flame for the dead. Lee knelt beside one, lighting it with trembling fingers. The fire caught weakly, flickering in the wind. "Rest easy," she whispered. Behind her, footsteps approached. Juno Park limped into view, one arm in a sling, his other hand clutching a tin mug of cold ration coffee. He looked exhausted, older than he had a week ago. "Still playing medic," he said, trying for a smile. Lee stood slowly. "Someone has to." He nodded. "Yeah, you always were the stubborn one." They stood together in silence for a while, watching the candles burn. Around them, the survivors spoke in low voices. Humans sat beside insectoids, Thrill beside reptilians. The lines between species had blurred, burned away in fire and loss. "Command says rescue ships are coming," Juno said, 3 days out. Lee didn't answer. He glanced at her. "You okay?" She took a long breath. "I don't know, I keep thinking about the professor." Juno nodded slowly. "He went out like a hero." "He was a teacher," Lee said softly. "He didn't even believe in war." Juno's eyes dimmed. "None of us did, but he learned fast." She looked down at her hands. They were scarred, bandaged, and still shaking. "He said once that humans don't fear death, we own it. I didn't understand then, I do now." Juno turned to her. "And what does it mean to you?" She met his gaze. "It means we don't run from it, we carry it, every face, every name. That's why we fight so hard, because we know what it costs." Juno stared at her for a long time, then gave a slow nod. "You sound like a soldier now." "I don't want to be," she said quietly. "None of us did," he said again, but his tone was gentle. Later that day, Lee went to what remained of the infirmary. The roof was gone, and the walls were little more than rubble, but she set up a small station anyway. The wounded still came, limping, crawling, leaning on one another. A reptilian cadet approached, her green scales dulled with soot. "You saved me," she said. "Back in the dome, I never thanked you." Lee shook her head. "You don't need to." The cadet bowed her head. "Before this, I thought humans were just killers." Lee's hands froze on the bandage she was wrapping. The cadet's voice trembled. "But you fought for us. You stayed when everyone else ran. You saved even the Keth prisoners. I was wrong about you." Lee swallowed hard, her chest tight. "We're all wrong about someone," she said softly. When the cadet left, Lee sat down on the floor, exhausted. Her medkit was empty again. Her whole body hurt. But for the first time since the attack began, she let herself breathe. Outside, she could hear faint laughter, human and alien together. Survivors sharing rations, sharing stories. Somehow life went on. That evening, the sky turned clear for the first time in days. Stars shone bright through the thinning smoke, their light cold and endless. The survivors gathered once more in the courtyard, standing beneath that vast sky. Professor Carthvin's name was spoken first. Then the others. Human, alien, soldier, student, it didn't matter anymore. Each name rose into the air like a spark carried away on the wind. When it was over, Lee stepped forward. Her voice was hoarse but steady. "He asked us once," she said, "who among us had killed." A ripple went through the crowd. Those who had been there remembered. "At the time," she continued, "I didn't raise my hand. I thought being a medic meant I was different, that I didn't carry that weight. But now I know the truth. We all do." She looked around at them. At Juno, at the cadets who had fought beside her, at the aliens who had once feared her kind. "I killed to save. I killed because there was no other way. And I'll remember every life I took and every life I saved. Because that's what it means to be human. Not the fighting, not the killing, the remembering." The crowd was silent. Even the wind seemed to still. Then slowly Juno raised his good arm in a salute. One by one the others followed. It wasn't a salute of soldiers. It was something older, a gesture of respect, of unity, of grief. Lee's throat tightened. She blinked back tears and lifted her own hand to her heart. Later, as the crowd dispersed, Juno found her again. "You gave them hope," he said quietly. She smiled faintly. "We gave each other hope." He looked up at the stars. "Think the galaxy'll remember what happened here." Lee followed his gaze. The stars glimmered like 1,000 eyes watching. "Maybe, or maybe it doesn't matter. What matters is that we do." He nodded. "Yeah, that's enough." For a long time, they stood together in silence, watching the night sky stretch wide and endless above the broken world. The fires were out. The war, at least here, was done. And in that quiet, Lee finally felt what she had fought for. Not victory, not vengeance, but peace. The kind you build from ashes, one breath, one heartbeat, one memory at a time. The rescue ships came 7 days after the last battle. By then, the smoke over Tirask IX had thinned into gray ribbons. The air was clearer, but the scars of war remained carved into the earth, craters, shattered towers, burned forests. The Galactic Academy, once the shining heart of knowledge, was nothing but bones and dust. When the first silver ships broke through the clouds, the survivors stood in silence. No one cheered. No one spoke. They just watched the sky, weary and hollow, as help finally arrived too late for most of them. Lee Vance stood beside Juno at the edge of the courtyard, her uniform torn, her face pale and streaked with ash. She should have felt relief. She should have been happy to see the ships. But instead, she felt nothing, just the steady ache of everything she'd lost. "They're here," Juno said quietly. "Yeah," she answered. He looked around at the surviving cadets, at the aliens and humans standing shoulder to shoulder. "We made it, Lee, against all odds." She gave a small nod. "We did, but the professor didn't." Juno's eyes dimmed. "He'd say it was worth it." "I know," Lee whispered, "but that doesn't make it easier." The rescue crews landed and began to unload. Medics, soldiers, engineers, rushing across the ruins, shouting orders. They handed out water, blankets, medicine. Some cried when they saw what was left. Others just stood in shock. An alien commander, tall and silver-skinned, approached Lee and Juno. His expression was grim. "You're the ranking survivors." Juno saluted weakly. "Sergeant Juno Park, Galactic Corps. This is Corporal Lee Vance, Medical Division." The commander looked around. The reports said the Keth took the academy. How did you stop them? Juno hesitated, then he smiled faintly. We didn't stop them, we survived them. The commander frowned, clearly unsatisfied with that answer, but Juno didn't explain further. There were no words that could describe what they had done, what they had become in those 7 days. Later, when the survivors were being loaded onto the ships, Lee took one last walk through the ruins. She passed the burned-out lecture halls, the cracked marble stairs, the collapsed library dome. Everywhere she looked, ghosts lingered, students she had healed, soldiers she had lost, and a professor who had believed that humanity was too violent to ever understand peace. She reached the spot where Carthven had made his last stand, where the reactor had glowed like a second sun. The air was cool now. The metal floor still shimmered faintly, humming with residual energy. Lee knelt there and placed her hand on the ground. "You saved us," she whispered. "You believed in us when you didn't have to." Her voice broke. She closed her eyes, letting the silence wrap around her. For a long time, she didn't move. Then she stood, shoulders straight, and walked back to the ships. 3 weeks later, the Galactic Council gathered in orbit above Tirask IX. Delegates from 50 worlds attended, their faces solemn. The survivors were invited to speak. When Lee stepped onto the platform, the hall fell silent. She looked around at the endless rows of alien faces, feathered, scaled, crystalline, metallic. None of them looked like her, but all of them were waiting to hear what humanity had done. Some with fear, some with curiosity. She took a breath. "Professor Carthven once asked us a question," she began, her voice steady but soft. "He asked, 'Who among you has killed?'" A faint murmur rippled through the chamber. Many remembered hearing of that question. It had spread through the academy even before the war. Lee continued. "Every human in that room raised their hand. Every one of us, except me. I thought that made me different. I thought it made me better, but I was wrong." She paused, looking down at her hands, still scarred, still trembling. "When the Keth came, I saw what killing really meant. I saw people die in my arms. I saw friends throw themselves in front of fire to save others. And I learned something that day." Her voice rose, quiet but strong. "We humans don't fight because we love war. We fight because someone has to stand between death and the innocent. Because someone has to hold the line when everyone else runs. That's what makes us who we are." Silence filled the hall. Even the translators paused. Lee's eyes glistened as she looked across the alien crowd. "I raised my hand in the end, not because I wanted to, but because I understood. Killing doesn't define us. Why we do it does, and if that's what makes us human, then I'll carry it for all of us." She stepped back, no applause followed. Just a deep, solemn quiet, the kind that meant the truth had sunk in too deep to break. Weeks later, the Galactic Academy began rebuilding. New walls rose from the ruins, stronger and brighter than before. And on the central courtyard where the last stand had taken place, a statue was raised. It showed 2 figures, a thrilled professor, his crystal form reaching upward, and beside him, a human woman kneeling with a medkit in one hand and a rifle in the other. The plaque below read, "For those who fought not for power but for life, for those who remembered." Years passed. Lee returned to Earth once, but she couldn't stay. The stars called her back. She joined the new Galactic Medical Corps, training both humans and aliens in battlefield rescue. Sometimes, when she spoke to young cadets, she would tell them the story of Tirask IX. She always ended the same way. The professor asked who had killed. Every human raised a hand except the medic. But in the end, she did too, not because she wanted to take life, but because she wanted to protect it. That's what humanity means. The cadets always sat in silence afterward, the way the galaxy once did. And as Lee walked away, she would look up at the stars, the same stars that had watched her bleed, fight, and rise, and whisper, "We're still here." Because humanity never stopped. Because even in ashes they remembered. Because when the universe asked who has killed, they answered, "The ones who saved."